For 3 long years, Prince Alexander had maintained his silence. While tabloids screamed headlines, social media exploded with theories, and the world watched his family fracture in real time, the future king had said
Almost
nothing.
ready.
Not
Is
a
everyone
single
set?
word about his brother's
Yes, all
dramatic
set here.
departure from royal life. Not one comment about the woman who had changed everything. Not even a whisper about the accusations that had rocked the monarchy to its core. But silence, like glass, can only bend so far before it shatters. On a crisp autumn morning in London, as photographers gathered outside Kensington Palace for what they thought would be another routine royal engagement, Prince Alexander did something that would send shockwaves around the globe. He stopped walking. He turned to face the cameras, and for the first time in 3 years, he spoke the words that millions have been waiting to hear.
We must
I think it's
address this
time I told you the
immediately.
truth about Sophia.
The consequences will be
The
severe.
world held its breath. Royal watchers
What
felt
the
their
hell
hearts
was
skip.
that?
I have
News
no
anchors
idea.
scrambled for
Did
their
you get it?
phones.
No, it was too fast.
Because when the
Blurry.
most private member
I've
of
learned
the
that
most
true
watched
composure
family
isn't
on
the
Earth
absence
decides
of
to break
feeling,
his silence,
but the strength to
you
carry
know the
on
story
despite
that
it.
follows will change everything you thought you knew. This is that story. This is what really happened behind the palace walls. This is why a prince who never speaks in public chose this moment, this day, to finally set the record straight about the woman who married his brother,
splendid
divided his family,
Indeed,
and
my
walked
dear.
away from the crown.
setting is
What
beautiful.
Alexander revealed
As
that
always.
morning would expose secrets that had been buried for years, friendships that had been destroyed by lies, and a truth so complicated that even those closest to the royal family had never understood the full picture. The silence was finally broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington
You know,
Palace
this reminds me
as
of the
Prince
time at the
Alexander
lake house.
adjusted his navy
We
suit
were all
jacket
so
and
carefree
stepped
then.
out of the black Range Rover. He had made this walk 1,000 times before, from car to palace entrance, past the gathered photographers, through the familiar routine of royal duty, but today felt different. Today, the weight in his chest had grown too heavy to
I
carry
have
in
a
silence
plan
any
that will
longer.
work. Are you
The
sure,
photographers
Sophia?
raised their
Yes,
cameras
I'm
expectantly.
Let's hear it.
They were used to his polite
The implications
nods,
are far-reaching,
his brief
but often
waves,
overlooked.
the way he would
That's an astute
stride
observation.
purposefully
Exactly.
toward
Most
whatever
people miss
engagement
that
awaited
depth.
him inside. What they weren't prepared for was the moment when Alexander stopped walking, turned to face them directly, and spoke the words that would change everything. I think it's time I told you the truth about Sophia. The clicking of camera shutters fell silent. Even the traffic on Kensington High Street seemed to pause. In that moment, every person present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Prince Alexander, the man who had perfected the art of saying nothing, was about to say everything. His private secretary, James Morrison, felt his blood turn to ice. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't scheduled, approved, or cleared through proper channels. This was a royal crisis unfolding in real time, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Alexander's hands were steady as he faced the cameras, but his mind raced back to where it all began. 3.5 years ago, when his younger brother Prince Marcus first brought Sophia Williams home for dinner, she had been different from the beginning, confident where previous girlfriends had been nervous, direct where others had been deferential, American where tradition expected British aristocracy. When my brother first introduced us to Sophia, Alexander continued, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, the first thing she said to me wasn't "Your Royal Highness" or even "hello." She looked me straight in the eye and said, "So you're the one everyone's afraid of." I thought she was joking. I later realized she was the only person who had ever been completely honest with me from the moment we met. The royal family had been intrigued by Sophia from the start. She was a successful actress with her own career, her own money, and her own opinions about everything from climate change to royal protocol. She didn't need them, which made her fascinating to a family accustomed to people who desperately wanted their approval. Alexander remembered the early months clearly. Sophia would join them for family dinners at Windsor Castle, and she would actually argue with his father, King Edward, about politics. Not disrespectfully, but with the kind of intellectual passion that the king hadn't encountered in decades. Instead of being offended, Edward seemed energized by these debates. Finally, he had told Alexander privately, "Someone in this family who isn't afraid to disagree with me." The queen consort, Catherine, had been more cautious. She watched Sophia carefully during those early visits, noting how the young woman observed royal protocol while subtly questioning its necessity. "She's studying us," Catherine had confided to Alexander. Not in a calculating way, but like an anthropologist trying to understand a foreign culture. Marcus, meanwhile, was completely smitten. Alexander had watched his younger brother fall in love before, but this was different. Marcus seemed more confident, more purposeful when Sophia was around. She challenged him in ways that made him better, questioned his assumptions about duty and tradition in ways that made him think more deeply about his role as a royal. Alexander paused in his impromptu press conference, watching the journalists frantically taking notes. He knew that every word he spoke would be analyzed, dissected, and debated for months to come. But for the first time in years, he didn't care about the consequences. The media painted Sophia as an outsider who didn't understand our world, he continued. The truth is, she understood it better than most of us. She saw the contradictions we had trained ourselves to ignore. She questioned the traditions we followed without thinking, and she did it all while genuinely trying to fit in, to be what Marcus needed her to be. Behind the cameras, Alexander could see his protection officers growing increasingly nervous. They were trained to handle physical threats, not emotional revelations. But there was no protocol for stopping a prince who had decided to speak his truth. The relationship between Sophia and the royal family had been complicated from the beginning, but not for the reasons the tabloids suggested. The real tension hadn't come from cultural differences or protocol violations. It had come from something far more fundamental: Sophia's unwillingness to pretend. Alexander remembered one particular evening at Sandringham, about 18 months into Marcus and Sophia's relationship. The family had been discussing an upcoming tour of Commonwealth countries, and Sophia had asked why they couldn't spend more time addressing climate change during the visits. Because, King Edward had explained patiently, we have to be politically neutral. We can't take sides on controversial issues. Sophia had looked genuinely confused. But is protecting the environment really controversial? I mean, shouldn't leadership sometimes mean taking a position on things that matter? The question had hung in the air like a challenge. It was the kind of question that revealed the careful balance the royal family maintained, visible enough to remain relevant, but careful enough to avoid offense. Sophia's American directness kept exposing the delicate compromises that made their system work. Alexander's voice grew stronger as he continued his unexpected statement to the press. The problems began not because Sophia couldn't adapt to royal life, but because she adapted too well. She saw how the institution worked, and she had ideas about how it could work better. That made some people uncomfortable. The truth was that Sophia had thrown herself into royal duties with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. She studied British history, learned about Commonwealth politics, and approached charity work with the same professionalism she had brought to her acting career. But she also asked questions that no one else had thought to ask. Why did they support certain charities and not others? Why were some royal traditions maintained while others had been quietly abandoned? Why did they spend so much time at ceremonial events and so little time addressing systemic problems? Alexander remembered one conversation with Sophia about 6 months before she and Marcus announced their engagement. They had been walking through Hyde Park after a particularly formal state dinner, and she had seemed unusually quiet. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she had said. "Of course. Do you ever feel like you're playing a character? Like the person you are in public is completely different from who you actually are?" Alexander had stopped walking. It was a question he had asked himself countless times but had never heard spoken aloud. Every day, he had admitted. "How do you live with that?" Sophia had asked. "How do you look in the mirror knowing that most people will never know who you really are?" It was the kind of conversation that Alexander had never had with another member of his family. The royal training was too complete, the boundaries too firmly established. But Sophia existed outside those boundaries, which gave her permission to ask the questions they had all learned not to ask. Sophia saw through the performance, Alexander told the assembled journalists, his words carrying across the courtyard with startling clarity. She understood that we were all playing roles, but she couldn't understand why we had to play them 24 hours a day. She thought there should be space for authenticity, even within the constraints of royal duty. The engagement had been announced with all the traditional fanfare. Marcus and Sophia had posed for photographs, given carefully orchestrated interviews, and begun the process of planning a wedding that would be watched by billions. But behind the scenes, tensions were growing. The palace staff had struggled to manage Sophia's approach to royal duties. She wanted to understand the reasoning behind every decision, to be involved in planning rather than simply following instructions. She questioned why certain photographers were given access and others weren't, why some events were prioritized over others, why the royal family's environmental concerns weren't reflected in their travel choices. She wasn't trying to be difficult, Alexander explained to the cameras. She was trying to be effective, but effectiveness and tradition don't always align. Alexander's protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, was now speaking urgently into her radio. This impromptu press conference was creating security concerns, media management nightmares, and constitutional complications all at once. But Alexander seemed oblivious to everything except the need to finally tell this story. The real crisis had begun about 4 months before Marcus and Sophia's wedding. Alexander remembered the exact moment because it had happened during a family meeting about the ceremony details. They had been discussing the guest list when Sophia had made a suggestion that changed everything. "I was thinking," she had said, "about my friend Maya from college. She runs an organization that helps refugee women start businesses in London. Would it be possible to invite her and maybe highlight the work her organization does during some of the wedding events?" The suggestion had been met with polite smiles and diplomatic explanations about why wedding guest lists couldn't be used for political statements. But Sophia had pressed the point. "I'm not trying to make a political statement," she had said. "I'm trying to use this platform for something meaningful." "Isn't that what royal weddings are supposed to do? Inspire people?" King Edward had explained the various protocols and traditions that governed royal weddings. The guest list was determined by diplomatic necessity, family relationships, and centuries of precedent. There wasn't room for personal friendships or charitable advocacy. Sophia had listened politely, but Alexander could see that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what her life would become. The wedding wasn't going to be a celebration of her relationship with Marcus. It was going to be a state occasion that happened to feature their marriage. That conversation changed everything, Alexander told the journalist, his voice carrying a weight of regret that surprised him, not because of what was said, but because of what Sophia finally understood. She realized that marrying Marcus meant disappearing into an institution that would make every decision for her, including decisions about how she could help people. After that meeting, Sophia had begun asking different questions. Instead of wondering how she could make royal duties more effective, she began wondering whether royal duties could ever truly address the problems she cared about. Instead of trying to understand royal protocol, she began questioning whether protocol served any meaningful purpose beyond maintaining institutional power. Marcus had been caught in the middle, trying to help Sophia navigate royal expectations while also beginning to question those expectations himself. Alexander watched his brother struggle with competing loyalties, to his family, to his duty, and to the woman he loved. The final crisis had come 6 weeks before the wedding, during what should have been a routine meeting about charitable patronages. Sophia had been offered several organizations to support as a working royal, but she had wanted to create her own foundation focused on women's economic empowerment. The palace advisors explained why that wasn't possible. Alexander continued, his voice growing heavy with the memory. New royals typically take on existing patronages rather than starting new organizations. It's more efficient, creates fewer administrative complications, and maintains established relationships. But Sophia had already spent months developing ideas for her foundation. She had researched similar organizations, identified potential funding sources, and even begun informal conversations with women entrepreneurs who could serve as mentors. The suggestion that she should abandon this work to cut ribbons at garden parties had been devastating. Alexander remembered the conversation he had with Sophia 2 days after that meeting. She had called him, which was unusual, and asked if they could meet privately, which was unprecedented. They had met at a small cafe in Notting Hill, far from the usual royal haunts. Sophia had looked exhausted, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like grief. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest," she had said. "Is there any way to be married to Marcus and still be myself?" Alexander had wanted to lie, to offer reassurance and hope, but Sophia's question deserved an honest answer. "I don't know," he had admitted. "I've never seen anyone manage it successfully." That conversation had lasted 3 hours. They had talked about duty and sacrifice, about the difference between service and performance, about whether it was possible to help people while living in a system that seemed designed to maintain distance from the very people you were supposed to serve. Sophia didn't leave because she couldn't handle royal life, Alexander told the cameras, his voice growing stronger as he approached the heart of his revelation. She left because she understood royal life too well. She saw that the institution would require her to become someone else entirely, and she wasn't willing to disappear. The decision to end the engagement had been made 3 weeks before the wedding. The official announcement cited irreconcilable differences about their future roles, but the reality was far more complex. Sophia hadn't just been walking away from Marcus, she had been walking away from a system that she believed was fundamentally incompatible with the person she wanted to remain. Alexander paused, looking directly into the cameras for the first time since he had begun speaking. Around him, the courtyard had filled with more journalists, palace staff, and curious onlookers. His words were being broadcast live around the world, but all he could think about was the conversation he had never been allowed to have publicly. "My brother Marcus made the hardest decision I've ever seen anyone make," Alexander said, his voice filled with admiration and sadness. He chose love over duty, but more than that, he chose to become the kind of person who could love someone without asking them to disappear. The aftermath of the broken engagement had been brutal for everyone involved. The media had painted Sophia as a selfish American who couldn't handle royal responsibility. Marcus had been portrayed as weak and indecisive. The royal family had endured months of speculation about dysfunction and crisis, but the real story had been much quieter and much more profound. Marcus had realized that he agreed with Sophia's questions about royal life. He had begun to see the institution through her eyes, and he had decided that some things were more important than tradition. As Alexander continued his unprecedented press conference, he knew that his words would create new crises, new questions, new challenges for his family. But 3 years of silence had taught him that some truths were too important to keep hidden. The first part of the story was finally being told, the part about how a prince had learned to speak, and what he had discovered in the silence before he found his voice. Alexander's hands remained steady as he continued his impromptu revelation, but inside Kensington Palace, chaos was erupting. His private secretary James Morrison was frantically making phone calls while trying to maintain his composure. The Queen Consort's office was demanding an immediate briefing. The Prime Minister's office was asking whether this constituted a constitutional crisis. And somewhere in Montecito, California, Prince Marcus was probably watching his brother's press conference with a mixture of pride and terror. "I know what you're all thinking," Alexander said to the assembled journalists, his voice carrying a hint of the dry humor that his friends knew well but the public rarely saw. "Why am I telling you this now? Why, after 3 years of silence, am I standing in a palace courtyard talking about my family's private business?" The truth was that Alexander had been planning this moment for months, though not consciously. It had begun with small rebellions, declining certain ceremonial duties, asking questions about the effectiveness of royal patronages, pushing back against media strategies that he found manipulative or dishonest. But the real catalyst had come 2 weeks ago, when he had received an unexpected phone call. Sophia had called him from Los Angeles, where she was filming a new movie about women's rights activists. The conversation had been brief but profound. She wasn't calling to ask for anything or to complain about her treatment in the British press. She was calling to thank him. "Thank you for what?" Alexander had asked. "For seeing me," Sophia had said simply. "For understanding that I wasn't the villain in this story. For knowing that leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done, but that staying would have been impossible." That conversation had haunted Alexander for days. He realized that while he had understood Sophia's position privately, he had never defended her publicly. He had allowed the narrative to stand unchallenged while she endured years of character assassination in the British tabloids. 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation that made me realize I had been complicit in a lie, Alexander told the cameras. Not an intentional lie, but the kind of lie that comes from staying silent when you should speak truth. I realized that my silence hadn't protected my family. It had protected a false narrative that was hurting someone who didn't deserve it. Behind him, Detective Inspector Collins was now joined by 3 other protection officers. They formed a discreet perimeter around Alexander, but they couldn't protect him from the consequences of his own words. This wasn't the kind of threat they were trained to handle. Alexander thought back to the days immediately following Marcus and Sophia's broken engagement. The palace machine had moved into crisis management mode with military precision. Official statements were crafted, media strategies were deployed, and a narrative began to emerge that painted the situation as unfortunate, but ultimately for the best. The story that took hold was predictable. American actress proves unable to adapt to royal life and responsibilities. The undertone was even more damaging. Sophia Williams had been selfish, demanding, and ultimately unwilling to make the sacrifices that royal duty required. Alexander had watched this narrative develop with growing discomfort. He knew it was wrong, but he also knew that challenging it would create even more problems for his family. So he had remained silent, hoping that time would soften the story and allow everyone to move on. But time hadn't softened anything. Instead, it had calcified the lie into accepted truth. Sophia became the symbol of modern selfishness. The woman who had everything but wanted more. The American who couldn't understand British values of duty and service. The narrative that emerged after the engagement ended was convenient for everyone except Sophia, Alexander said, his voice growing harder. It allowed the institution to appear reasonable and accommodating, while painting her as unreasonable and demanding. It allowed the media to have a clear villain and a tidy story. And it allowed my family to avoid asking difficult questions about why someone who genuinely wanted to serve had found it impossible to do so. The real story had been far more complex and far more troubling. Alexander began to recount details that had never been made public, moments that revealed the institutional pressures that had gradually worn down Sophia's resolve. There had been the incident with the speech she had wanted to give about women's education in developing countries. Sophia had spent weeks researching the topic and working with experts to craft a meaningful address. But the palace communications team had rewritten it to remove anything that might be considered too political, leaving behind generic platitudes about the importance of education. She had something meaningful to say, but meaningful and safe are often incompatible in royal communications. There had been the charity gala where Sophia was told she couldn't meet with the young refugees whose stories had inspired the event, because photographs of her with asylum seekers might be misinterpreted by certain media outlets. Instead, she was positioned with wealthy donors who could provide good photo opportunities but had no personal connection to the cause. There had been the environmental initiative that Sophia had wanted to champion, only to be told that the royal family's position on climate change had to be carefully balanced against economic concerns and political sensitivities. Her passion for urgent action was transformed into polite expressions of concern and awareness. Each of these incidents was small, Alexander said. Each one was explained and justified. Each one made perfect sense within the context of how the institution operates. But together, they sent a clear message. Your ideas matter less than our image. Your convictions matter less than our comfort. Your authenticity matters less than our control. Alexander paused, looking around the courtyard that had now filled with dozens of journalists, photographers, and curious onlookers. He could see palace staff hovering at windows, probably trying to figure out how to end this impromptu press conference without creating an even bigger spectacle. But Alexander wasn't finished. The second part of his story was about what had happened after Sophia left. The conversations his family had never allowed themselves to have, the questions they had avoided, and the slow realization that losing Sophia had revealed fundamental problems with the way they operated. After Sophia left, Alexander continued, my brother Marcus began asking the kinds of questions that we had all been trained not to ask. He wondered whether royal service was actually serving anyone besides the institution itself. He questioned whether maintaining traditions was more important than addressing modern problems. And he asked whether it was possible to be both authentic and royal in the 21st century. These conversations had happened mostly in private, during long walks through Windsor Great Park, or quiet dinners at Highgrove. Marcus had been processing his grief over losing Sophia, but he had also been processing a larger disillusionment with the role he had been born to play. Alexander remembered one particular evening, when Marcus had said something that crystallized the entire situation. I finally understand why she left. It wasn't because she couldn't handle being royal. It was because being royal means handling things instead of changing them. The royal family's approach had always been about management rather than transformation. They managed crises, managed public opinion, managed expectations, and managed their own behavior to fit within carefully defined parameters. But management and leadership were different things, and Sophia had been calling them toward leadership. Marcus realized that Sophia hadn't been asking for special treatment, Alexander explained to the cameras. She had been asking for the right to be effective. She wanted to use her platform to create actual change, not just to maintain comfortable relationships with existing power structures. This realization had led Marcus to begin making his own changes. He started choosing his own charitable work based on impact rather than tradition. He began speaking more directly about issues he cared about, even when it made palace advisors uncomfortable. And he began dating again, but with different criteria. He was looking for someone who would challenge the institution rather than simply adapting to it. Alexander's voice grew warmer as he talked about his brother's evolution. Marcus became braver after Sophia left, not because he stopped caring about his family or his duty, but because he redefined what duty meant. He decided that his duty was to the people the institution was supposed to serve, not to the institution itself. This shift hadn't gone unnoticed within the royal household. There had been meetings about Marcus's new direction, concerns about his changing priorities, and diplomatic discussions about whether his approach was sustainable within the traditional framework of royal duty. But something interesting had happened. Marcus's work had become more effective. The charities he supported saw increased donations and volunteer engagement. The causes he championed gained public attention and political momentum. His authentic passion for environmental issues and social justice resonated with younger generations who had previously seen the royal family as irrelevant. The irony, Alexander told the assembled journalists, was that Marcus became better at being royal by caring less about appearing royal. He found his voice by refusing to let others write his script. Alexander's own awakening had been slower and more gradual. As the future king, he carried different pressures and expectations. His training had been more intensive, his boundaries more rigid, his role more carefully defined. But watching Marcus's transformation had forced him to examine his own relationship with royal duty. The questions had started small. Why did he attend certain events that seemed to serve no purpose beyond tradition? Why did he give speeches that said nothing meaningful about issues he genuinely cared about? Why did he allow his public persona to be so different from his private convictions? These questions had led to bigger ones. What was the point of inherited privilege if it couldn't be used to address inherited problems? What was the value of institutional stability if the institution wasn't serving its stated purpose? What was the meaning of service if it was performed for cameras rather than for people? I began to realize, Alexander said, his voice growing more personal, that I had spent my entire adult life being trained to be a symbol rather than a person. And I started wondering whether the world needed more symbols or more authentic leadership. This internal evolution had accelerated 6 months ago, when Alexander had visited a homeless shelter in Manchester. It was supposed to be a routine royal visit: tour the facilities, meet the staff, take some photos, make some reassuring comments about the good work being done. But one of the residents, an 18-year-old named David who had aged out of foster care, had asked Alexander a question that changed everything. "Do you think about us when you're not here?" The question had been asked without malice or expectation. David genuinely wanted to know whether royal visits were just performances, or whether they reflected ongoing concern and commitment. Alexander had given the expected answer about how much the royal family cared about these issues, but the question had haunted him for weeks. Did he think about homeless youth when he was at state dinners? Did he consider housing policy when he was attending garden parties? Did his royal duties connect to the problems he witnessed during his public engagements, or were they separate performances happening in parallel? That young man's question forced me to confront the gap between my public role and my private conscience, Alexander told the cameras. I realized that I had become very good at appearing to care while remaining carefully insulated from the consequences of the problems I was supposed to be addressing. This realization had led Alexander to begin making his own quiet changes. He started spending more time learning about the issues behind his ceremonial duties. He began asking his staff harder questions about the effectiveness of his work. And he started pushing for more substantive engagement with the problems he encountered during public appearances. The changes hadn't gone unnoticed. Palace advisors had expressed concerns about Alexander's increasingly serious approach to his duties. There had been suggestions that he was taking things too personally, and that he needed to maintain appropriate emotional distance from the causes he supported. But Alexander had reached a point where appropriate distance felt like moral cowardice. He had started to understand what Sophia had been trying to tell them 3 years ago: that authentic service required genuine engagement, which meant accepting the risk of being changed by the people you were trying to help. I started to understand, Alexander said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with new authority, why Sophia had found it impossible to remain inside our system. Not because the system was evil or corrupt, but because it was designed to prevent the kind of authentic engagement that makes service meaningful. As Alexander prepared to reveal the third part of his story, he could see that his protection officers were becoming increasingly anxious. This press conference had already lasted far longer than anyone could have anticipated, and there was no protocol for ending it gracefully. But Alexander wasn't concerned about protocol anymore. He was concerned about truth. And the truth about his family's relationship with Sophia Williams was more complicated than anyone had been allowed to know. The second part of his story was ending, but the most important revelations were still to come. The crowd in the Kensington Palace courtyard had grown significantly as word spread about Prince Alexander's unprecedented press conference. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing every moment of what historians would later call the most consequential royal statement since his great-great-grandmother's abdication speech nearly a century ago. But Alexander seemed oblivious to the growing chaos around him, focused entirely on telling a story that had been buried for too long. "What I haven't told you yet," Alexander said, his voice growing more intense, "is what happened during the 6 months between when Sophia left England and when the official announcement was made about the broken engagement. Those 6 months changed everything for my family, but we never allowed anyone to know it." The media narrative had been simple. Sophia Williams had broken off her engagement to Prince Marcus and returned to America to resume her acting career. The timing had been presented as her decision, made after careful consideration of her inability to adapt to royal life. But the truth had been far more complex and far more painful for everyone involved. During those 6 months, Sophia had actually remained in London, living quietly in a small flat in Chelsea. She hadn't fled back to Hollywood as the press had been told. Instead, she had been working with a small team of advisors to develop a comprehensive proposal for reforming royal charitable work. Sophia spent those 6 months creating the most thoughtful analysis of royal duty that anyone in my family had ever seen, Alexander revealed. She wasn't running away from royal life. She was trying to reimagine it. The proposal had been extraordinary. Sophia had researched how other European monarchies balanced tradition with modern effectiveness. She had studied successful charitable organizations to understand what made them impactful. She had interviewed young people across the Commonwealth to learn what they wanted from royal leadership. And she had developed a detailed plan for how the British royal family could maintain its ceremonial role while becoming a more effective force for positive change. The document had been titled Service and Substance, a framework for 21st century royal duty. It was 47 pages of carefully researched recommendations, supported by data, examples, and case studies. It had been professional, respectful, and revolutionary. She proposed that we could maintain our traditional ceremonies while adding new responsibilities that actually addressed modern problems, Alexander explained. Royal weddings could raise awareness about domestic violence. State dinners could highlight global poverty. Garden parties could celebrate community activists instead of just wealthy donors. The proposal had suggested that young royals could spend sabbatical years working directly with the organizations they patronized, not just visiting them for photo opportunities. It had recommended that royal speeches include specific policy recommendations rather than general platitudes. It had outlined ways to measure the actual impact of royal charitable work rather than just counting attendance figures and media coverage. Most radically, Sophia had proposed that the royal family could use their platform to challenge systemic problems rather than just managing their symptoms. They could advocate for housing policy changes instead of just visiting homeless shelters. They could support immigration reform instead of just meeting with refugee children. They could champion environmental legislation instead of just expressing concern about climate change. The proposal was brilliant, Alexander said, his voice filled with admiration and regret. It showed how we could honor our traditions while actually making them meaningful. It demonstrated that respect for the institution and effectiveness of the institution weren't incompatible. But the proposal had also been threatening to the established order. It challenged the careful political neutrality that had allowed the monarchy to survive for centuries. It questioned the value of ceremonies that served no purpose beyond maintaining institutional prestige. It suggested that the royal family should be judged by their impact rather than their intentions. Alexander remembered the family meeting where Sophia's proposal had been discussed. It had taken place at Balmoral Castle on a cold February evening, with snow falling outside the windows and tension filling the room inside. The entire senior royal family had been present. King Edward, Queen Consort Catherine, Alexander himself, and Marcus, who had been advocating for his girlfriend's ideas with passionate conviction. My father read every page of Sophia's proposal, Alexander told the cameras. He took notes, he asked thoughtful questions. He acknowledged that many of her ideas had merit, but ultimately he concluded that implementing them would require changes that the institution wasn't prepared to make. The conversation that followed had been one of the most honest discussions the royal family had ever had about their role and purpose. King Edward had explained the delicate balance that kept the monarchy viable in a democratic society. Any appearance of political activism could undermine the cross-party support that was essential for the institution's survival. Queen Consort Catherine had worried about the security implications of deeper engagement with controversial issues. If royal family members became advocates for specific policy changes, they could become targets for political opposition in ways they had never experienced before. Alexander himself had been torn between admiration for Sophia's vision and concern about its practicality. He could see how her proposals could make royal work more meaningful, but he could also see how they could destroy the careful consensus that allowed the monarchy to exist at all. The tragedy, Alexander said, his voice heavy with emotion, wasn't that Sophia's ideas were wrong. The tragedy was that they were probably right, but we weren't brave enough to try them. Marcus had fought for the proposal with everything he had. He had argued that the monarchy's biggest threat wasn't political controversy, it was irrelevance. He had pointed out that younger generations already saw the royal family as an expensive anachronism and that Sophia's approach could make them relevant again, but the institutional pressures had been overwhelming. Palace advisors had warned about constitutional crises. Government officials had expressed concerns about political complications. Long-serving royal staff had worried about abandoning approaches that had worked successfully for decades. We had a choice, Alexander explained to the growing crowd of journalists. We could evolve or we could stay safe. We chose safety, and we lost someone who could have helped us become what we claimed to be. The decision to reject Sophia's proposal hadn't been made in a single conversation. It had happened gradually, through a series of meetings where her ideas were discussed, appreciated, and ultimately set aside. Each individual decision had seemed reasonable, but collectively they had sent a clear message. The institution was more important than innovation. Stability was more valuable than effectiveness, and tradition was more sacred than truth. During a private meeting with King Edward, she had asked a question that had haunted the family ever since. If you're not willing to change anything meaningful, what's the point of having this conversation? The king had tried to explain that change within a monarchy had to happen slowly, that sudden shifts could destabilize the entire system. But Sophia had pressed him on what slowly meant in practical terms, and whether slowly was fast enough to address urgent problems like climate change, inequality, and social injustice. My father realized during that conversation, Alexander said, that Sophia was asking him to choose between preserving the institution and fulfilling its stated purpose. And he chose preservation. The end had come not with drama, but with quiet resignation. Sophia had thanked the royal family for considering her ideas, acknowledged that she understood their position, and made it clear that she couldn't remain part of a system that she no longer believed was serving its intended function. She didn't leave because she couldn't handle royal duty, Alexander repeated, his earlier words taking on new meaning. She left because she took royal duty too seriously to pretend it was working. The final conversation between Sophia and Marcus had taken place in Hyde Park during a walk that lasted 4 hours. Alexander had learned about it only later, when Marcus had needed someone to talk to about the hardest decision of his life. Marcus had offered to leave the royal family with Sophia, to give up his titles and his position so they could build a life together outside the institution. But Sophia had refused, understanding that asking Marcus to abandon his family and his birthright would be another form of the same selfishness she was being accused of. She told Marcus that she loved him too much to ask him to choose between her and his family, Alexander revealed, his voice breaking slightly. She said that real love meant wanting the other person to be their best self, and that Marcus's best self included being a prince who could help people. Instead, Sophia had proposed something different. She would leave England and end their relationship publicly, taking full responsibility for the broken engagement. Marcus would remain with his family but would honor her ideas by trying to implement them gradually, from within the system. They made a pact, Alexander said, looking directly into the cameras. She would sacrifice her happiness for his future, and he would sacrifice his comfort for the changes she believed in. It was the most selfless thing I've ever witnessed. The public announcement of the broken engagement had been carefully crafted to protect both Sophia and the royal family. She was presented as someone who had tried her best but ultimately couldn't adapt to royal life. The royal family was presented as understanding and supportive, disappointed but not bitter. Nobody had been allowed to know that Sophia had actually developed a comprehensive vision for modernizing the monarchy, or that she had spent 6 months working with experts to make that vision practical and achievable. Nobody had been allowed to know that the royal family had seriously considered her proposals, or that King Edward had been genuinely impressed by her research and analysis. We allowed the world to think that Sophia had given up, Alexander said, his voice growing stronger. But the truth is that she gave everything she had to try to make our institution better. And when that wasn't enough, she gave up her own happiness to protect the person she loved. Alexander paused, looking around the courtyard that was now packed with journalists, photographers, palace staff, and curious members of the public. He could see police officers trying to manage the growing crowd, and he knew that his words were being broadcast live around the world. But he also knew that the most important part of his story was still untold. The part about what had happened during the 3 years since Sophia left, and why he was choosing this moment to finally reveal the truth. The third part of this story, Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, is about what Sophia's sacrifice has meant for my family and why her influence on us didn't end when she left England. As Alexander prepared to reveal the final chapters of this unprecedented story, he could see his protection officers growing increasingly concerned about crowd control and security. But he also knew that some truths were worth any risk, and that the time for careful silence had finally passed. The most important revelations were still to come. The helicopters overhead had multiplied, and Alexander could see that news trucks were lining up along Kensington High Street. What had begun as an impromptu statement had become a global media event, but Alexander felt oddly calm as he prepared to reveal the most personal and consequential part of his story. For 3 years, he said, his voice carrying across the now crowded courtyard, my family has been living with the consequences of losing Sophia. Not just Marcus, who lost the woman he loved, but all of us. Because Sophia's influence didn't end when she left England, it began. The changes had started small and largely invisible to the public. Marcus had begun choosing his charitable work differently, focusing on organizations that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. King Edward had started asking his advisors harder questions about the effectiveness of royal engagements. Queen Consort Catherine had begun researching the social issues behind the ceremonies she attended, but the most significant changes had been internal, emotional, and deeply personal. The royal family had begun having conversations they had never allowed themselves before, conversations about purpose, authenticity, and whether their inherited privileges were serving any meaningful function in the modern world. Sophia had asked us questions that we couldn't forget, Alexander explained. Even after she left, those questions kept echoing in our private conversations. Were we making a difference, or just making appearances? Were we serving the public, or just serving the institution? Were we being leaders, or just playing characters? Alexander's own transformation had begun about 18 months after Sophia's departure, during a routine visit to a food bank in Birmingham. He had been there to mark the organization's anniversary, following the usual script of touring the facilities, meeting volunteers, and making supportive comments about their important work. But something had gone wrong with the carefully planned schedule. Alexander had arrived early, before the official visit was supposed to begin, and he had encountered something that wasn't part of the program: a line of people waiting for food assistance that stretched around the block. I saw families with children, elderly people, working people who couldn't afford groceries despite having jobs. Alexander recalled, these weren't the carefully selected beneficiaries I was supposed to meet during the official visit. These were the people the system was actually serving, and they looked nothing like the success stories I was used to hearing about. Alexander had made a decision that horrified his protection officers, but changed his understanding of his role forever. He had left his car and walked along the line of waiting people, introducing himself not as a royal visitor, but as someone who wanted to understand what they were experiencing. The conversations that followed had been unlike anything in his previous royal experience. People had told him about choosing between heating and eating, about working multiple jobs but still not earning enough to feed their families, about the shame and desperation that had brought them to seek help from a food bank. One woman told me that she was a nurse at the local hospital, Alexander said, his voice heavy with emotion. She was working full-time taking care of other people, but she couldn't afford to take care of her own children. She asked me whether I thought that was fair, and I realized I had never really thought about it at all. That encounter had led Alexander to begin researching poverty and inequality in ways that went far beyond the briefing papers his staff usually provided. He had started reading academic studies, following policy debates, and trying to understand the systemic factors that created the problems he witnessed during his official duties. The more he learned, the more he understood what Sophia had been trying to tell them. The royal family's traditional approach to charity work, visiting organizations, expressing sympathy, and encouraging public support, wasn't addressing the underlying issues that made those organizations necessary in the first place. I realized that I was participating in a performance that made everyone feel good while allowing the real problems to continue unchanged, Alexander explained. I was helping people feel better about inequality without doing anything to actually reduce inequality. This realization had led Alexander to begin pushing for changes in his own royal duties. He had started requesting meetings with policymakers in addition to charity workers. He had begun asking for detailed briefings about government programs related to the issues he encountered. He had started trying to understand how royal influence could be used more effectively to address systemic problems. The resistance from palace advisors had been swift and determined. Alexander had been reminded about the importance of political neutrality, the risks of appearing to advocate for specific policy positions, and the dangers of moving beyond the traditional boundaries of royal involvement. But Alexander had persisted, inspired by Sophia's example and motivated by his growing understanding of the problems he was supposed to be helping address. He had begun making subtle changes in his public statements, asking more pointed questions during his visits and requesting more substantive briefings about the issues behind his ceremonial duties. I started trying to be the kind of royal that Sophia had envisioned, Alexander said. Not someone who just showed up for photo opportunities, but someone who actually understood the problems and tried to contribute to solutions. Marcus had been making similar changes, though his approach had been different. Instead of pushing against institutional boundaries, he had been working to expand them gradually from within. He had begun collaborating with academic researchers, meeting privately with policy experts, and developing his own version of the comprehensive approach that Sophia had proposed. My brother realized that he couldn't implement Sophia's full vision immediately, Alexander explained, but he could honor her ideas by becoming more knowledgeable, more engaged, and more effective in his royal role. Marcus had also been more direct about addressing the false narrative that surrounded Sophia's departure. During private conversations with trusted journalists, he had begun correcting misunderstandings about why the engagement had ended. He had made it clear that Sophia hadn't been unable to handle royal responsibility. She had been unwilling to accept royal responsibility that wasn't actually responsible to anyone. These efforts had been subtle but significant. Gradually, a more nuanced understanding of Sophia's departure had begun to emerge in some media outlets. Stories had appeared suggesting that her decision had been more complex than originally reported, that she had actually been deeply committed to royal service but had different ideas about how that service should be performed. Marcus never stopped loving Sophia, Alexander said, his voice growing tender. But more than that, he never stopped learning from her. Every choice he's made over the past 3 years has been influenced by the questions she taught him to ask. The most dramatic change had come in King Edward himself. Alexander's father had been deeply affected by Sophia's departure, not just because of the personal pain it caused Marcus, but because of the institutional questions it had raised. During private family conversations, King Edward had begun acknowledging that Sophia's critique of royal charitable work had been largely accurate. The royal family did spend most of their time attending ceremonial events that served no purpose beyond maintaining their own visibility. They did avoid addressing systemic problems in favor of managing symptoms. They did prioritize their institutional comfort over their stated mission of public service. My father started asking himself whether preserving the monarchy was worth anything if the monarchy wasn't actually serving its intended purpose, Alexander revealed. He began to wonder whether we were protecting an institution that had lost touch with its own values. This internal crisis had led King Edward to begin implementing some of Sophia's suggestions quietly, without acknowledging their source publicly. He had started asking for more detailed impact assessments of royal charitable work. He had begun requiring his staff to measure the actual effectiveness of royal engagements, rather than just counting attendance and media coverage. Most significantly, King Edward had begun allowing his children more freedom to engage with controversial issues, recognizing that strict political neutrality might be less important than authentic engagement with the problems the royal family was supposed to be addressing. The irony, Alexander said, looking directly into the cameras, is that Sophia's influence on our family became stronger after she left than it had been while she was with us. Her absence forced us to confront questions that we had been avoiding, and her example inspired us to become more honest about our own role and responsibilities. But the most profound change had been in the family's understanding of what duty actually meant. For generations, royal duty had been defined as following established protocols, maintaining traditional relationships, and avoiding anything that might threaten institutional stability. Sophia had challenged this definition, suggesting that real duty meant serving the public interest, even when it conflicted with institutional interest. She had argued that authentic service required genuine engagement with the problems people faced, not just ceremonial acknowledgement of their existence. Sophia taught us that duty isn't about following rules, Alexander explained. It's about taking responsibility for the power you've been given and using that power to help people. Everything else is just performance. This new understanding of duty had led each member of the royal family to make different choices about how they use their positions. Marcus had become more directly involved in policy discussions about the issues he cared about. King Edward had begun pushing government officials more aggressively on behalf of the causes he supported. Queen Consort Catherine had started using her platform to advocate for specific legislative changes, rather than just general awareness. And Alexander himself had begun preparing for the moment when he would need to publicly acknowledge what Sophia had meant to his family and what her departure had taught them about themselves. "We owed her the truth," Alexander said, his voice growing stronger as he approached the climax of his revelation. "We owed her recognition for the courage she had shown and the sacrifice she had made. And we owed the public an honest accounting of what really happened and why." The decision to make this public statement had been Alexander's alone, though he knew it had the private support of his father and brother. They had all recognized that the false narrative about Sophia's departure had done damage not just to her reputation, but to public understanding of what royal service should actually involve. "Today isn't just about setting the record straight about Sophia," Alexander explained. "It's about announcing that our family has learned from her example and that we're committed to becoming the kind of royals she envisioned. People who use their privilege to serve the public interest, even when it's difficult or controversial." As Alexander prepared to reveal the final part of his story, he could see that the crowd in the courtyard had grown beyond anything his protection officers could easily manage. But he also knew that the most important revelation was still to come, the one that would explain not just what had happened in the past, but what was going to happen next. The fourth part of his story was ending, but the most consequential announcement was still ahead. The autumn sun was beginning to set over London, casting long shadows across the courtyard where Prince Alexander had been speaking for nearly 2 hours The crowd had grown to include hundreds of journalists, thousands of curious onlookers, and millions more watching live broadcasts around the world. But Alexander seemed energized rather than exhausted as he prepared to deliver the conclusion of his unprecedented revelation. The final part of the story, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the packed courtyard, isn't about what happened in the past. It's about what's happening right now and what's going to happen next. Alexander paused, looking directly into the cameras with an intensity that made it clear he was about to announce something that would change everything. Behind him, palace windows were filled with staff members watching, in a mixture of fascination and horror. This wasn't just a press conference anymore. It was a constitutional moment that would reshape the British monarchy. 2 months ago, Alexander continued, I received a phone call that I had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Sophia called to tell me that she was engaged. The crowd fell silent. This wasn't information that had been reported anywhere, and the implications were staggering. After 3 years of speculation about whether Sophia might reconcile with Prince Marcus, she was apparently moving on completely. Her fiancé is Dr. James Morrison, not my private secretary, but an American doctor who runs a non-profit organization providing medical care to refugees, Alexander explained. She met him while volunteering at a clinic in Los Angeles, and she says he's the first person she's dated who loves her for her commitment to helping people, rather than despite it. Alexander's voice was filled with genuine happiness as he talked about Sophia's engagement. It was clear that whatever complicated emotions surrounded her relationship with his family, he truly wanted her to find happiness and fulfillment. During that phone call, Sophia told me something that I haven't been able to stop thinking about, Alexander said. She said that her experience with our family had been the most painful and the most educational of her life. Painful because she had to give up someone she loved, but educational because it taught her what she was willing to sacrifice for and what she wasn't. Sophia had explained to Alexander that her time with the royal family had clarified her own values and priorities in ways she hadn't expected. The process of trying to fit into an institution that prioritized stability over impact had forced her to articulate exactly what kind of impact she wanted to have in the world. She told me that leaving England had been the hardest thing she had ever done, but that it had also been the most important, Alexander revealed, because it had taught her that compromise was only worthwhile if it moved you closer to your goals, not further away from them. This conversation had prompted Alexander to ask himself similar questions about his own life and role. What was he willing to sacrifice for, and what was he unwilling to compromise on? What kind of king did he want to become, and what changes was he prepared to make to become that person? The answers had led him to make a decision that he was now ready to announce publicly for the first time. 3 weeks ago, Alexander said, his voice growing stronger with each word, I submitted a formal proposal to the Privy Council, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Prime Minister. The proposal outlines a comprehensive modernization of the British monarchy that would implement many of the ideas that Sophia developed during her 6 months in London. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs and frantic note-taking. This wasn't just a statement about past events. It was an announcement of revolutionary changes that could reshape the institution of monarchy itself. The proposal includes several key changes, Alexander continued, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. First, future monarchs and senior royals will be required to spend at least 2 years working directly with the charitable organizations they patronize, not just visiting them for ceremonial purposes. This change would mean that Alexander himself, as the future king, would need to take sabbaticals from traditional royal duties to work in homeless shelters, environmental organizations, refugee assistance programs, and other causes that the royal family claimed to support. Second, royal charitable work will be measured by actual impact rather than just public attention. We will publish annual reports showing how our involvement has affected donation levels, volunteer recruitment, policy changes, and concrete improvements in people's lives. This requirement would transform royal charity work from a largely ceremonial function into something that could be evaluated based on measurable outcomes. It would mean that the royal family's effectiveness could be judged by objective standards rather than just traditional expectations. Third, senior royals will be allowed and encouraged to advocate for specific policy changes related to the issues they work on, within carefully defined parameters that maintain constitutional propriety. This was perhaps the most radical change of all. For centuries, the British royal family had maintained strict political neutrality, avoiding any appearance of advocating for particular policies or legislative changes. Alexander's proposal would allow royals to use their platforms more actively while maintaining appropriate constitutional boundaries. Fourth, the royal family will commit to using our properties, resources, and influence in ways that demonstrate the values we claim to represent. This includes making our estates carbon neutral, ensuring fair labor practices in all our operations, and opening more of our resources to public use. This change would address criticisms that the royal family preached values they didn't practice in their own operations. It would require them to align their private behavior with their public advocacy in ways that had never been required before. And fifth, Alexander said, his voice growing more personal, future royal marriages will include formal discussions about how both partners can maintain their individual identities and continue pursuing their personal missions within the framework of royal duty. This final change was clearly inspired by Sophia's experience and designed to prevent future situations where talented, committed people felt forced to choose between love and authenticity. These changes won't be implemented overnight, Alexander acknowledged. They require constitutional review, parliamentary consultation, and careful coordination with the governments of Commonwealth realms. But the process has already begun, and I'm committed to seeing it through regardless of the political or personal costs. Alexander paused, looking around the courtyard that had become the site of the most consequential royal announcement in decades. He could see reporters frantically updating their stories, photographers capturing every expression, and palace staff probably planning emergency meetings to deal with the implications of his words. But Alexander wasn't finished. The most personal part of his announcement was still to come. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," he said, his voice growing softer but somehow more compelling. "Last week I called Sophia to let her know that I was planning to make this statement. I wanted her to be prepared for the renewed media attention it would create, and I wanted her to know that my family was finally ready to acknowledge the truth about her departure and her influence on us." Sophia had been surprised that Alexander was willing to risk institutional stability for the sake of honesty and reform. Alexander had been humbled by Sophia's continued generosity toward a family that had failed to appreciate her vision when it mattered most. During that call, I asked Sophia whether she thought the changes I was proposing would actually make a difference, Alexander said. Her response was something I'll never forget. "The question isn't whether they'll make a difference, Alexander. The question is whether you're willing to become the kind of person who makes them work." That challenge had crystallized everything for Alexander. The institutional changes he was proposing were important, but they were meaningless without personal transformation. Rules and procedures could be modified, but authentic leadership required becoming someone different than he had been trained to be. "Sophia taught my family that real service means being changed by the people you're trying to help," Alexander explained. "It means allowing your comfortable assumptions to be challenged, your safe routines to be disrupted, and your inherited privileges to be questioned." This understanding had led Alexander to make one final announcement that would demonstrate his personal commitment to the changes he was advocating for the institution. "Starting next month, I will begin a 2-year sabbatical from traditional royal duties to work directly with organizations addressing homelessness, poverty, and social inequality," Alexander revealed. "I will be living in housing projects, working in food banks, and sleeping in homeless shelters, not for photo opportunities or ceremonial visits, but as a full-time volunteer trying to understand what it means to serve people rather than just representing them." The crowd fell completely silent as the implications of this announcement sank in. The future King of England was volunteering to give up his comfortable palace life to live and work among the most marginalized people in British society. "This sabbatical isn't a publicity stunt or a political statement," Alexander clarified. "It's recognition that I can't effectively lead an institution dedicated to public service if I don't understand what service actually requires. It's acknowledgement that inherited privilege is only valuable if it's used to understand and address inherited disadvantage." Alexander's voice grew more emotional as he approached the end of his statement. "Sophia Williams came into our family with ideas about how we could better serve the people we claim to represent. We rejected those ideas because they threatened our comfort and challenged our assumptions. But rejecting her ideas didn't make them wrong. It just revealed our own limitations." The final part of Alexander's announcement was the most personal and perhaps the most important. "Today, I'm not just setting the record straight about what happened 3 years ago," he said, looking directly into the cameras with unflinching honesty. "I'm announcing that the British royal family is ready to become what Sophia always believed we could be. An institution that serves people rather than serving itself, that creates change rather than just managing appearance, and that uses inherited privilege to address inherited problems." Alexander paused one final time, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd and the millions watching around the world. "Sophia Williams never became a princess, but she changed the future of the British monarchy more than anyone in living memory," he concluded.
"She did it by asking questions we were afraid to answer, by refusing to accept that's how we've always done it as a sufficient explanation, and by choosing authenticity over comfort, even when it cost her everything she wanted.
As Alexander finished speaking and began walking back toward the palace, the crowd remained silent for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. This hadn't been just a press conference or even a royal statement. It had been a transformation of an institution, of a future king, and of the very idea of what inherited privilege could mean in the modern world. Behind the cameras, palace staff were already beginning to plan for the most significant changes to the British monarchy since the abdication crisis of 1936. Constitutional experts were analyzing the implications of Alexander's proposals. Political leaders were calculating the risks and opportunities of supporting or opposing royal reform. But for Alexander himself, walking back into Kensington Palace after 2 hours of unprecedented honesty, the most important work was just beginning. He had broken his silence about Sophia Williams and announced his vision for the future of the monarchy. Now he had to prove that he could become the kind of person who could make that vision real. The rare comment had become a historic declaration. The silence was finally broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. 3 years later, historians would mark this autumn afternoon as the moment when the British monarchy chose evolution over extinction, authenticity over appearance, and service over self-preservation. But on that day, as the sun set over London and the crowd slowly dispersed, it felt like something both simpler and more profound. The moment when a prince finally found the courage to tell the truth.